Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Velasquez. Thank you for joining Metropolitan Community College. November is National Native American Heritage Month. While November is the time to rejoice in diverse and rich cultures, histories, and traditions, and to appreciate the great contributions of Native Americans, it also allows us to spread awareness about tribes or to educate people about the various challenges faced by Native Americans in the past and today. We recognize that Metropolitan Community College campuses were built on indigenous homelands and resources that were previously cared for by people from the Omaha, Ponca, and various regionally based tribes that traveled to and from their original homelands. Ponca Chief Standing Bear and his people were held on the Fort Omaha campus in 1879, pending his landmark civil rights case granting Native Americans the right of habeas corpus. The United States obtained the land from the Omaha Nation in the Treaty of 1854. We recognize our obligations to this land and to the people who took care of it, as well as to the nearly 18,000 Native people who live in Nebraska today. Your microphones and chat with other audience members are turned off, but you may always contact the hosts. Send your questions at any time to moderator Barbara Velasquez for the final Q&A session. Also, watch for a link for the online evaluation in today's program posted in the chat. Maunka Morgan is a citizen of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska. He lives on the Winnebago Indian Reservation, where he works for the Nebraska Indian Community College, serving as a division head for both the business administration and Native American Studies programs. Maunka has an extensive background in Native nation building, which includes executive experience in tribal government, economic development, healthcare, entrepreneurship, and higher education. He has served on the Winnebago Tribal Council as the CEO for the Saginaw Chippewa Tribe of Michigan's Economic Development Corporation, the executive director for the Ponca Tribe of Nebraska, as a senior executive for Ho-Chunk Inc., the economic development arm of the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska, and was the longest tenured president of the Little Priest Tribal College. Maunka holds a Master of Business Administration degree in Healthcare Management and specialization in accounting from the University of Phoenix. Additionally, he holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration degree in Management and Native American Studies from the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Maunka's mission statement is to empower Native nations everywhere. Welcome, Maunka Morgan, who will share his thoughts on More Than a Word.
Thank you for that introduction. I'll introduce myself properly in my language, the Ho-Chunk language. Ho hichikoraniwi hinikaragiwi egi Ho-Chunk yarasha maunka hingairina. Anaga wakanja hiki karachija wa ujena. Anaga Ho-Chunk nishocheja ho wawahijena. Niki karagiwi hanichara haipiwina. Good to see everybody. Niki karagiwi, welcome everyone to this circle. And my relatives, they know me as Maunka. I'm a member of the Thunder Clan, and I'm a Ho-Chunk here living along what we call the turbulent waters, which is a reference to the Missouri River here in Northeast Nebraska on our treaty lands. I wanted to sort of preface this documentary, which I watched a couple times. It's pretty good. But I think this is something that I cover in my Native American Studies courses. And certainly a topic I would cover in Introductory to Native American Studies and Contemporary Native Issues. But let's get some base terminology down, what we're really talking about. We're talking about prejudice and discrimination in society. That's really what we're discussing here. And I think that the mascot issue itself highlights that. It's sort of, I would say, a centerpiece of what we would think of as institutional racism in America, if not abroad for that matter. It's the same type of thinking. But we could move to the first slide, please. So what is prejudice? Prejudice is essentially, it's just a word derived from the Latin derivative. It just means prejudgment. We're prejudging people based on sort of our own lenses, right? A prejudiced person might say, or someone we're arguing with if we're protesting at Arrowhead Stadium, for example, hey, my mind is made up. Don't confuse me with the facts, right? So don't confuse my paradigm. Prejudice is an attitudinal system. And I think in the documentary, you're going to find out that I think Susan Harjo really states it succinctly when she says that it begins with the attitudinal framework, essentially. And from the attitudinal framework, action. And in my words, it's the paradigm. And from there, the expression of that paradigm. So what happens is policy and law gets expressed. And that's the action that Susan is discussing. So that's the attitudinal system. And so prejudice can exist within any group. It doesn't matter if it's a majority group or a minority group. Next slide. There's essentially 3 levels. We won't go heavily in depth with these, but there's a cognitive level, just the thinking level of prejudice. And then there's the evoking of the emotional level of prejudice. And then there's the action oriented. And that's consistent with, I think, what's being discussed in the documentary. Next slide. Cognitive level of prejudice, it really just encompasses a person's beliefs and perceptions of a group as threatening or non-threatening. They're inferior, okay? Could be their intellect, how they look, right? They could be possessing positive or negative characteristics at this cognitive level. But what's important here, I think, at the cognitive level is generalizations. Generalizations are formed in people's minds. So ethnocentric and prejudicial attitudes, excuse me. And there's a difference. Next slide. What is ethnocentrism? Our history, and I say our history as a collection of survivors of genocide on what we would call the Great Turtle Island here, North, Central, and South America. Some of the native peoples refer to their traditional territories, something other than Great Turtle Island. But in our history here, locally, our native history, we refer in our creation stories that this land is referred to as the Great Turtle Island. But ethnocentrism, we're survivors of this attitudinal framework because it's been manifested in many forms against our peoples. In fact, it's what we would call the American Holocaust. We're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions, if you extrapolate in all the lost lives that the births that would have been brought into this world. So ethnocentrism essentially is it's just a generalized rejection of other people or outgroups on the basis of their in-group focus. And in our history, that has to do with religion. Religion as it connects to law, US domestic law and international law. Okay, so basically it's prejudice rejecting people just solely on the basis of their membership of another belief or another group. Okay, next slide. This emotional level of prejudice, it just refers to those feelings that are evoked, that a minority group arouses in an individual. These emotional attitudes, they could be negative or positive. And these feelings based on beliefs about that group, they could be triggered by social interaction or the possibility of an interaction. For example, in our society, right, Christians might react with fear or anger to the integration of their community with non-Christians. That's why we got the Muslim ban, right? So it may be couched as some sort of safety thing, but let's call it what it is. All right, it's Muslim ban. It's a religious ban on another people's belief system. Next slide. There's this idea, connected idea of self-justification under prejudice. So we want to justify. So self-justification involves denigrating a people or a group to justify maltreatment of them. And when this happens, self-justification leads to prejudice and discrimination against members of another group. And so I provided a couple quick sources, and hopefully, I mean, if you're studying Native studies, we're talking about a lot of history. So in a nutshell here, I want to get to the source. This is actually from the Pope's hand writing in 1452. So this notion and idea of superiority, it comes from actual what's called the papal bulls from the Pope Alexander V and the VI. If we can convince ourselves that another group is inferior, immoral, or dangerous, we may feel justified in discriminating against those members, enslaving them, and even killing them. And for example, committing genocide or ethnocide on Native people because they're viewed as what's quote unquote merciless Indian savages. And that's the Declaration of Independence, actually. So that's that whole idea, right? So here's the founding fathers writing, creating, and cultivating this ideal, right, of the merciless Indian savage, and literally written into their institutional documents, governing documents, against all non-Christians, which are essentially Indian savages, as the Pope's papal bull states in both 1452 and so forth, and actual court rulings. History is filled with examples of people who thought their maltreatment of others was just and necessary. As defenders of true faith, the Christian crusaders, they would go out and kill Christ killers, Jews or infidels, Muslims, whether they're Christian pioneers, pilgrims, or settlers, etc. They exploited or killed Native Americans who were, quote, heathen savages or, quote, barbarian and beasts. And all that really means in that context is that they're unbaptized people. And that's the definition that they gave for the word barbarian and beast for our peoples here. And whites mistreated, enslaved, or killed African Americans who were an inferior species. The list can go on, all right? So in a contrasting view, self-justification can work in the opposite, such as serving as a basis for subjugating others. The subjugation occurs first, and then the self-justification follows. Next slide. Racism. Essentially, racism, I won't go heavy into this slide, but it's a concept following the establishment of the African slave trade. But going down to the bottom of this slide, it says further, from an ideal state, a society stratified in tiers, but believed it would be necessary to persuade the traders and work people that by divine decree, they were made from brass and iron, while the warriors were made of silver and the rulers of gold. So my example is see Trump Tower. If you've ever been to Trump Tower, it's gold. Or the Vatican City, 1% wealth gap, capitalism, corporations, etc. Remember, I'm a business major too, so I sort of have a perspective on both sides of the coin there. And those sort of institutions connect back to that whole idea that was propagated in the papal bulls and then in later US Supreme Court cases. Next slide. Another example of self-justification serving as source of prejudice is the dominant group's assumption of an attitude of superiority over other groups. In this respect, establishing a prestige hierarchy, ranking the status of various ethnic groups results in differential association. Again, here's an example right from the US Supreme Court Johnson v. McIntosh of 1823 ruling. It's really a Christian versus non-Christian paradigm, really. As written by Chief Justice John Marshall, quote, and the character and religion of its inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe. And insert white people or white Christians for the word Europe. And it's coded that way. They want to use the word Europe or European to hide the fact that this is really this ethnocentric construct stemming from the religious belief system. It goes on to say who might claim an ascendancy to have dominion over them, to be superior over them. Next slide, please. Socialization. So this is really what this the dangers of this documentary is getting to, is the socialization. It's really the social cultural conditioning of these mascots being used, sadly, by places we would think that we send our kids to learn in. Whether it's a higher education institution or whether it's a public school K through 12 system, we are socially conditioning them and allowing them to be educated through the socialization process when, for example, maybe we're at a sports arena, whether it's a high school or Arrowhead Stadium, and they're doing the tomahawk chop and other mockeries of Native culture, okay? And the second bullet here, a child's worldview forms from their first model, that's the parents, and then others in the absence of an alternative view for comparison. So that's even more reason when you have 80,000 people in a stadium and they're experiencing these mockeries of the tomahawk chop and other antics, is that that's a form of education, sadly. And that's really, I think, what this is, this type of video is about. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. By learning and automatically accepting the prevailing prejudices, an individual simply conforming to those norms. And some of those norms that we might see is the tomahawk chop, is those chants in the stadiums. That's a norm, right? That's a cultural norm. It's been normalized. So we're mocking the racist and prejudiced person's idea of Native culture is being normalized and taught to others to dehumanize another group of human beings through a self-justification and socialization process that they might call, quote, honoring you, honoring Indians, honoring you people, etc. Next slide. And then stereotyping. By attributing a particular image to the entire group, they becomes a justification for discriminatory behavior. And if any of you have ever experienced discrimination, I have, you could really think deeply about this and sort of the roots of it all. And hopefully this type of presentation at least give you sort of a base understanding of those things. And the one thing I want to point out on this slide about stereotyping is the use of Little Red Sambo. And as it similarly looks like Little Black Sambo. And so they're using cartoon characters to depict and to dehumanize Native people and their culture. Next slide, please. And there's the actual language. This concept called Ethnophobism, all it really means is the language of racism, essentially, and it's actual words that we use. So an official word, right? Ethnophobism or phallic language. So I pulled out, here's the actual Papal Bull document written by the Pope: to invade, search out, capture, to vanquish. The word vanquish is important because it is that idea is to vanquish. It's really to commit genocide and to eliminate all Native people. That's what that means. So here's the Holy Church or the Vatican. Actually, that's, I think, supposed to be following the 10 Commandments, I think. And that their standing mission statement is a standing declaration of war against all non-Christians, and then institutionalized in the United States Supreme Court case, Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823, to support that. And that is cited over and over again in subsequent cases, both here and internationally. And I want to add, there's a couple words here. So this is to take their possessions, to perpetually enslave people, right? And to appropriate to themselves for their use and their profit. So this idea of profit from a business standpoint, that's the idea of capitalism. Let that sink in for a moment. Next slide, please. All right. So there's different types of ethnophobism. And then, of course, there's disparaging names, whether it's the N-word. Native people have been called redskins, or derogatory terms like prairie niggers, stuff like that. And so there's different, and there's even sort of phrases that are used to degrade and disparage other people as well. Next slide. Okay, selective perception. More education doesn't necessarily reduce prejudice. Okay, we want to keep that in mind because we have a tendency to filter through our own beliefs and rationalize away information that does not sort of conform to their paradigm. Cooperative learning is suggested to help reduce prejudice in educational settings. Okay, and next slide. And just discrimination, we've talked a lot about that. Next slide. And 5 levels of discrimination, we get the physical abuse. So just think of genocide, think of taking of our children, think of boarding schools, think of the Native kids' bodies being repatriated back from these so-called mission schools back to their homelands, to their people, and being reburied. That's all funded by both tithing dollars and federal tax dollars. So the word tax and tithing is synonymous in definition, but certainly flowing through two different institutional sources to fund the genocide of Native people, actual policies, as along with states funding the scalping of Native people too, for children, women, and men. And then of course, extermination. That again, that word extermination is synonymous with the word in the papal bull that the Pope wrote to vanquish our people. Okay, end slides, I'm done. Hopefully that was fast enough. We can begin the video. There's a lot going on there, so enjoy the video.
So thank you everybody for your close attention. I think we've kept a real strong audience here. Maunka, let me share with you a comment that came in during the video. I presented this video with John Little to educators that are part of the National Education Association a few years back. Thank you for sharing this. My question is, there have been a few of us trying to combat the mascots we have here in the metro area, specifically Bellevue. The problem that we are running into is that the adults don't want to get rid of it because they believe that they have permission from one family and that they had Macy's students visit the school and took pictures to show them there. Do you have any suggestions on how to support us in this battle?
So I guess I don't know all the details of that. You're referring to a Bellevue High School?
Yes, that's the Bellevue
Chieftains?
Chieftains, that would be.
Yeah. So I graduated from Omaha North High School, and I remember playing the Bellevue Chieftains in one of my last Class A football games and attended some of their basketball games where I witnessed the actual antics and mockery of our Native culture right there in their at the basketball game. So I would say generally what at least the NCAA and universities have done, they've asked Native nations to submit some sort of form of support to keep that type of name. And that formal support would come in the form of what's called a tribal resolution. And that tribal resolution is actually a form of tribal law and policy that would acknowledge the continuing use of something like that. So I would say that one family or a photograph of kids is probably not enough. So that it's not representative of the continuation of to allow an institution that we tie the word education to allow the dehumanization and disparagement of Native people and to really cultivate a lot of, really what they're teaching is racism. So I'm against that. And I would think that the people that are standing against it, I support that and just to continue that fight. You know, the school doesn't have the tribe support. I don't think there's going to be any tribe around, any Native nation that's going to provide that resolution, not around here. So, in fact, to answer that question, I would actually ask the tribes to send a tribal resolution against it and send that directly to the schools. That would be even more powerful. And then even there's a commission within the state, at the state side, have them do something similar if they would do that. But certainly the Native nations who are, we're part of the community. We've been here for tens of thousands of years, and we provide jobs to natives and non-natives. We're part of the community, the city's named Omaha, right? So it's like
It seems too simple, doesn't it?
I know, it's like, you know, but see, that's the power of social cultural conditioning. It's psychological. This is a real psychological paradigm. It's very real for people. They've been socially and culturally conditioned. It's okay to disparage and to dehumanize another group of people, right? It's even rooted back into their institutional belief system, their religion, whether they know that or not, but we know that. And so that's why we teach about it. We educate others about it, to get them to connect and understand that even within their moral fabric, you know, their supposed moral fabric within that institutional paradigm of religion, that is to disparage us, to dehumanize us, to vanquish us, to enslave us, to take our possessions, our goods for their use, for their profit. So those are some practical ways, I would say. And you know, there's always some, you know, they'll find somebody, they're going to find somebody like that poll, or even, you know, when they show the Navajo code talkers, that is so, I can't even put that into words, how disgusting that was. You know, here's they're elders for one, they're warriors, and in our culture, it means something, means many other things than what's portrayed in these stadiums. And so what a dishonor to drag them out and put, you know, the Washington Redskins jackets and blankets on them to display that. And just like, you know, Black Horse said, it was to probably to come at her. Those are her own people. You know, and I lived out there. It's a big deal. So those veterans are held in high regard. And, you know, I just can't even, and just think if somebody actually thought that up. Somebody said, let's get the Navajo code talkers. Let's bring them out here. We'll display them. We'll get them on national television. And we'll show that they, you know, wow, really? I mean, it just goes to show you, you know, how it's a sickness. I mean, frankly, I don't know how else to put it. It's just on many levels, it's a sickness, but it's a very real psychology. But the good news is a lot of stuff's changing. So I'm open to questions. I hope I answered that one. I'm open to other questions.
So Malka, in the last week or so, I keep seeing documentaries that we show that just make me so angry. And I'm certain that there's probably some other people out there. I was watching faces of those people who still have their faces up. Towards the beginning of this documentary, these are some of the words that I heard people saying who are defending this. Entertainment, innocent, harmless fun. Mm-hmm. It's just a small fraction, a small group. Mm-hmm. All of those words just will irritate me for the rest of the day as I think about this. And I just wanted, you know, to throw those out and see if you can help us to further understand the dehumanization that comments like that have. I do agree with you that education can change things, but to have people who really don't know stand there and say that when somebody puts a microphone in front of them irritates me.
Hmm. Well, the dehumanization, it's in all of the literature. It's in the institutional governing documents, foundational documents of what we call the so-called United States of America. Now, those of us that teach this and understand the legal principles around the formation of this country, the curtain has been pulled back, and there is an actual legal movement, thanks to many Native scholars and non-Native scholars alike, to show the relationship that the United States foundational principles is the integration of church and state. And it's through church and state by the seminal case of the Johnson v. McIntosh, 1823 US Supreme Court case, where Chief Justice John Marshall actually uses the papal bull documents of the Vatican Church as the legal justification, essentially to commit, to violate all the 10 commandments, basically, that their religious belief system is supposed to, I guess, live by. And so that's a fact. That's not some sort of fiction. So that's the foundation. Church and state is one and the same. So now what I ask the audience to think about it now is you've got to now think the whole paradigm of church. And so you got to start to think about the replacement of the word state and the word court and use it synonymously with the word church. Then it puts it into context, because from policy is formed through court rulings and policy is formed through legislative acts. And so that policy is coming from what Susan Harjo was talking about, an attitudinal framework. So even in their own historical church documents, we're Saracens, we're pagans, we're infidels, we're enemies of Christ, we're less than human, we're Indians, we're Redskins, we're savages, we're beasts, we're barbarians, heathen savages. You know, even the word indigenous and aboriginal, people that they're proliferating at, and I'm concerned about that, because by definition, if you Google it now, the word indigenous and aboriginal, it's coming up something else, but by definition, it means colonized people. So we're taking on another misnomer and false identity, and we're stripping away the core answer to your question. It's like, what's the dehumanization? Well, when you put artificial titles from someone else's racist paradigm, ethnocentric religious paradigm, that they have some sort of moral superiority to rule the world, if not the universe, or maybe other dimensions, maybe, I don't know. But that's the thinking, is that we're not even human. And so what has flowed out of that is not honoring policies, but dehumanizing policy from the United States Congress, so the United Churches Congregation. So when you understand that church and state is one and the same, so what's consistent is that political paradigm of policy flowing outward, getting expressed. So that's why we actually had to pass a federal law to get a federal law passed to stop stealing our children. We had to get a federal law to stop stealing and desecrating our ancestors' graves. So we had to pass the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. Right? I mean, and now our own people were dealing with this and sort of going through this systemic process of decolonizing this false identity. And one of them is blood quantum, as it's connected to our identity. So here's the United States government, or the United Churches. And if you break down the word America, or America, it means the love of wealth and riches, like the love of greed, essentially, if you want to translate it that way. So that's what America breaks down to. So, keep that in mind, right? But they sent out in 1934 this idea to establish these constitutions, but they wanted to make sure these constitutions for tribes to adopt, to become their formal, governing documents. But they inserted a mathematical equation to identify people as a citizen or a treaty beneficiary recipient, is another way of saying it. But I want you to know this, is that eugenic system, they're saying to us, to get us to accept that we're a mathematical equation before we're a human being. That's dehumanization. And they've even got our people acculturated and assimilated through that boarding school era to even accept that, just like using the word Indian. I'm not somebody's Indian. The word Indian has a legal contextual meaning. It comes from that Johnson v. McIntosh ruling and the Christian doctrine of Christian discovery principles and tenets. It means that we are not human. It doesn't mean that the people from India. It has a legal context and application in law. So the word Indian really is just sort of this what Stephen Newcomb in his book, Pagans in a Promised Land, comes from the white man's imagination. And he uses cognitive science and cognitive theory in that well-written book to explain all that. But that's just, so blood quantum and eugenics is a clear example within our own tribal government institutional structures of us accepting the colonizer's idea of our identity, and we dehumanize ourselves. But outside of that, we see the mainstream, especially institutions of learning, that's disturbing on many levels. And so you get these policies and actions where people are acting out violence against people. I mean, just like the Asian attacks on this COVID thing, they're attacking Asian people and there's violence against them, you know, or how about the so-called illegal immigrants held in the ICE facilities on the United States border? And then they're sterilizing women. Thank goodness for the whistleblower nurse to expose that US taxpayers just last year caught sterilizing brown women in ICE facilities funded by US taxpayer dollars. So that's the mindset, that's the dehumanization. And it's so having mascots, it's just something that we can point to clearly because it's an institutional symbol and embodiment of that paradigm. So we need to get rid of it and get to the root identity of us. And that is simply that we are Wonk-Chicks. And I'm using the Ho-Chunk language. And I teach my students, I challenge them, I go, find out in your language that's tens of thousands of years old, that predates the Egyptians, the whole Christian narrative, all of that, of what we call ourselves in the creation in our language. That is our identity. And so in Ho-Chunk, Wonk-Chick means two-legged human being. And all that really exemplifies our relationship with the creation, with the sacred. Just so we have words for all descriptive, the four-legged, the wing, all life. So as long as we can get other people to define us in an artificial way, then we can continue to treat them badly, to dehumanize them and adopt policy, enact laws. And even in our own tribes, if we continue to use that same colonial system, we continue to be divided and conquered. And we serve their objectives to keep us at bay so that we never rebuild our nations and become strong again. But in order to do that, it begins with the individual identity, the individual level, the identity is acknowledging in our own tongue and our language that we are Wonk-Chicks first before anything. So okay.
Thank you. I know time is getting short, but I'm going to throw out some questions that are coming through, and we understand if any of you have to leave before time. I'm not sure this can be answered, Malka, but we have a question from audience members saying, why would the Navajo code talkers allow themselves to be put on display like that?
I think they got duped. That's what I think. I mean, I wasn't in the circle of conversation and how they got there, you know. There's one thing I've learned. I've traveled around to many Native nations in my professional work and to present to tribal leaders on their lands. And Native people are not trusted for good reason. And so you have to break down so that, you know, because they come in and people are there to manipulate you, right? They're showing up, they want to bring you gifts, whatever, but essentially they want your land. Okay, so Native people are aware of this. I suspect there was some sort of process like that, right? So here's a billion-dollar corporation, right? With branding, you know, essentially in business, we call it brand equity. There's a lot of brand equity in their team name. So they're going to keep it, right? It's making money at the expense of others. Okay. Without regard to other human beings, right? How it affects children's psycho-emotional well-being as the Freiburg research revealed. So I suspect that, you know, if you've ever interacted with a code talker, and I have, I mean, you know, they remind me of my grandparents. So I'm very respectful, and I stand and I be quiet when I'm talking to them. And then, but they, you know, and then when it's my turn to talk, I'll talk. But I don't really know how that happened, but I will say that those of us that know this game, how they're playing a game. They're playing a game with them. And without them, probably that organization, they were dehumanizing the code talkers. That's what really bothers me. They're being dehumanized and put on display like that. And I mean, I can't tell you how that, I mean, I can't put it into words, but let's just say, I guess the best word would be karma. And people don't realize that this is spiritual. They're not recognizing the spirituality of all this. And so whatever happens in the universe, because they're behaving that way, then that's on them. That's all I can say about that.
So people who follow sports probably realize that the Washington team does not use that name currently.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that some other scandals came up, and perhaps the team got rid of the name to kind of diverge from having to deal with the other stuff. So I guess what I'm saying is it wasn't necessarily done for the reasons that we might want it to have happened. Well,
actually, maybe it's that, but what I've learned just through some of the media outlets is it was about money. The corporate board structure, they put some people on their board that understood the issue. And under not only just the native mascot issue, but the broader issue of equality and representation. And that was the difference. And see, someone with a different mindset was in the circle of influence of decision-making at the governing structure, and then they just threatened to pull out the money. And then the name got changed all of a sudden. So to me, that's the real deal. And of course, all the scandals going inside and within that organization, again, so that's the same lack of character that probably brought the honorable Navajo code talkers there, the Dene is their true name, Dene code talkers there, and really to put them on display and in my view, dehumanize them. You know, that's the same characterless group of people. So no surprise there, right? That they're in trouble for other things probably.
So it sounds like all of our conversation is kind of coming together. We're asking what we can do with the high school team that's stubbornly held on. And when it comes down to it, the decision makers maybe need to change. Mm-hmm. People need to empower themselves. We always talk about voting, running for political office, mm-hmm. board members. I mean, it's kind of all related. Would you agree?
Yeah, so strategically, you're going just like the FedEx, you know, the stadium's called FedEx for the Washington football team. So there's different board members on there, right, that understand this issue. So same thing with the school board. So you have a strategy, an external strategy, and you have an internal strategy, you know. So get some people that are on the school board, and so that they're championing it within that decision-making framework, and then advance it there. And then, of course, you have your community, you know, in every one of their arguments. I mean, they would be shocked in terms of the facts that we would present to counter, you know, things like we're honoring you. This is a sense of respect. Well, let's just go through historically, bullet point by bullet point, and show how Native people have been honored and respected. I'll tell that to my grandmothers and my grandfathers and my relatives that were all victims of genocide. and that how we still deal with that nonsense today. And it's what I call, when I see these mascots, it's a clear example in our society of the failure of the educational system. It's a clear symbol of that.
Thank you very much. So, Malka, do you have any final comments before we have our closing slides on this topic?
No other questions? I didn't evoke any questions. Teresa,
well, we just get to the point. We've got classes here and they end at 3:45, so they've stayed beyond their time.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, there's a lot to be covered. It's just that probably the last thing I should say is that Native nations that use some of that imagery, it's connected to the idea of self-determination. We decide who we are. And people just need to understand there's even more evidence that our people have been on these lands that, I mean, we're very, very old people. And so here we are today in the modern era, again, trying to teach people about humanity, just like we taught them about democracy, just like we taught them about all of our agricultural products, 60% of by which feed the world today, our sciences, our engineering, our architecture, you name it, the list goes on. So, and here we are today, the people that, if you've seen the US Census lately, one of my old professors actually reached out to me. It's like, I don't know, 12 or 14 million, you can look it up, that are identifying as Native people. I responded back to my old professor and said, that would make a pretty large army. So, and that's just in the United States. So we're not talking about Canada. We're not talking about the Native people awakening in, what we call Central America, the Native people that are running their countries in South America. And so there's millions and millions of us. And frankly, we're sick of it. And it's just like, America's become like this illusionary place. It's like this, just like Stephen Newcomb, the author, states. He's a lawyer, by the way, really smart guy. He's like, he calls it the white man's imagination. We're tired of living in the white man's imagination. We're not going to live in it no more. And that's really what self-determination is about. And we're saying, as a self-determined people, really stop living in ignorance and living your ignorance, because we're not going to live in your ignorance no more. And we're just not going to allow it. So change the mascots, change it to something else. Stop hanging on to institutional racism and let it go. Let it go.
What a pleasure it's been to have you back at Metro, Malka. It's been long. So you can take this topic and really give us such a comprehensive view. I know that our audience members are going to be thinking and creating new ideas, and I really appreciate your inspiring all of that, especially with the theme, the national theme of Together Towards Tomorrow. I believe that it's really requires all of us to move forward. And you audience members, again, thank you for joining us. I so appreciate your willingness to ask your questions and not feel worried that you will be humiliated for the thoughts that you have. That's how we move forward here. Yeah. You're giving us reality to enrich the conversation. Yeah. Brian, could you please put up our evaluation slide? So you may, I believe you've seen this. Evaluation link, please go out to it. And it's in the chat. I will send it to you if I have your email in your Zoom account also. You can always contact our audience if you can't find the link, but we do appreciate your feedback. Final slide, please, Brian. Okay, this actually happens on Wednesday, and I apologize, I didn't let Brian know that I switched out slides, but Wednesday, November 10th at 10 a.m., we will have the honor of hearing from Cheryl Crazybull, who is the president and CEO of American Indian
College Fund.
Say it again, Malka.
The American Indian College Fund, Dr. John
Thank you,
Crazybull.
College
Yeah.
Fund. I apologize. I had it in my notes and I took it out because actually tomorrow at 9:30, if we see you, we have a session on autism, and our presenter is Sarah Sanders Gardner. So we hope to see you at 9:30 tomorrow for that one, and then back on Wednesday at 10 a.m. With Revolution in Higher Education, the History of Tribal Colleges. It's been a good afternoon, and I wish you all a nice evening. So long. Thanks, Malcolm.
Okay, you're welcome. Good to see everybody. Hani chara happy wina, wano skuni wi. Everyone be well in all the ways of wellness. Wano skuni wi. Wanaganapshana. Thank you.